Tonight, in this podcast, you are standing in the meticulously curated office of a family law attorney, and you're staring down at a stack of thick, watermarked paper that casually quantifies the exact price of your eventual betrayal.
Right.
You're supposed to be on the precipice of a lifelong commitment, you know? You are planning a wedding, you're spending your evenings imagining a shared future, intertwined lives, growing old with someone who knows the absolute depths of your character, and then without any warning, you find yourself forced to navigate the deeply unromantic, terrifyingly clinical what-ifs of a legal contract that, well, it diagrams the collapse of your love.
It's a profound, almost architectural failure of context. I mean, we take the language of romance, which relies entirely on faith and boundless optimism, and we just forcibly smash it into the language of litigation, which, relies entirely on suspicion and risk mitigation.
Yeah. Welcome to this deep dive. You are sitting at the intersection of two entirely different languages today, and our mission is to explore this quiet, really complicated collision between romantic ideals and financial realities. And we are going to do it without an ounce of judgment.
Exactly.
We are looking at the prenuptial agreement, but we are not looking at this as lawyers. We aren't looking at this as accountants. We are looking at the deeply human experience underneath the paperwork. So if you have ever felt that incredible tension, the feeling of profound unconditional love suddenly interrupted by the concept of a prenup, we're going to unpack exactly why that feels so incredibly heavy and why it makes complete human sense that you reacted the way you did.
Right. And my role here is to look at the psychological weight acting beneath those financial clauses. We've gathered a vast array of insights from behavioral scientists, clinical psychologists, and family law experts, and we are going to synthesize these wildly differing viewpoints impartially. We want to validate why this topic, perhaps more than any other pre-wedding discussion, strips away our defenses and just makes us feel so incredibly vulnerable.
Absolutely. But before we look at a single piece of data, before we even open the research stack, we need to look at the human picture.
Yeah, how it lives in the real world.
Right, how this actually manifests in the wild. So I want you to step into a scene that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Imagine you are sitting at the kitchen table with your partner. The wedding planning is in full swing. It's like a Tuesday night, you've just finished dinner, maybe you're looking at catering menus on a laptop. The venue is already booked, the deposit is paid. You are sitting in the warm, ambient glow of building this future together. And then the word prenup drops into the space between you.
It completely alters the atmospheric pressure of the room. Physically, the body responds before the brain even fully processes the legal implication.
You feel it in your gut instantly. It's a sudden stomach drop. It feels like the air is being sucked right out of the kitchen, pulling all the warmth and safety out with it. And instantly, a quiet, racing internal dialogue begins. It's a dialogue you might recognize. It sounds like, wait, do you not trust me? Are you already planning the exit strategy?
Right. What does this actually mean for us?
Yeah. Have I completely misread the foundation of this entire relationship?
And if we isolate this kitchen table scene and look really closely at the behavioral mechanics happening in that exact second, we see something deeply tragic. Both people in this scenario are operating from a place of intense, overwhelming fear. But they are experiencing two entirely different, diametrically opposed types of fear, which makes it nearly impossible for them to comfort each other.
It's a complete disconnect.
Precisely. On one side of the table, the person receiving the request feels a sudden existential threat to their romantic bond. To them, the request is a literal crack in the foundation. They are afraid of abandonment, of being undervalued, of conditional love. But on the other side of the table, the person who brought the document up is heavily armored because they're also deeply afraid.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they feel a primal need to protect their autonomy, their hard-earned safety, or the security of whatever they are bringing into the union. One person is terrified of losing the relationship, while the other is terrified of losing themselves within the relationship.
It reminds me of the concept of a pre-mortem in business strategy, but applied to the human heart. Like in a business pre-mortem, a team assumes a project has catastrophically failed before it even launches, right? And they work backward to figure out what killed it. That works brilliantly for software development or supply chains. But applying a pre-mortem to a romance, it forces you to sit with the architect of your dream home, and instead of picking out the marble for the kitchen island, the architect forces you to diagram exactly how the house will collapse during a magnitude 8 earthquake.
And legally divide who gets to keep the rubble.
Yes, exactly. It requires you to inhabit a reality where your partner has become your adversary.
That captures the cognitive dissonance perfectly. You are being asked by society, by lawyers, and by your partner to hold two completely contradictory states of mind simultaneously. Boundless, faithful optimism on one hand and catastrophic defensive pragmatism on the other. The human brain is not wired to process those two states at the exact same time without generating massive amounts of cortisol and anxiety. It just feels fundamentally unsafe.
This brings us to the core concept we need to name. I want to give you the vocabulary for what is actually happening here because we are dealing with something much, much larger than a legal document. We are dealing with an invisible structure that governs every single relationship on Earth. Psychologists call this the psychological contract.
The psychological contract is the shadow agreement. Beneath the legal prenuptial agreement, the literal, notarized pages that dictate the division of assets, the spousal support, the debt protection, lies a much heavier, entirely invisible contract. The psychological contract consists of all the unspoken, unwritten assumptions we carry about trust, power, loyalty, and what we fundamentally owe each other as partners.
I want to make sure I'm completely grasping the mechanics of this because it sounds somewhat abstract. When you say unspoken assumptions, what does that actually look like in practice? Because I assume most couples think they are communicating clearly.
Well, they communicate clearly about the logistics of life, sure, but rarely about the underlying philosophies. An unspoken assumption in a psychological contract might be, if I pause my career to raise our children, you will view my domestic labor as entirely equal in value to your financial income. Or, if your startup fails, I will support us financially without building resentment. These are massive, identity-defining agreements that couples rarely say out loud. They just assume their partner holds the exact same definition of fairness.
So the conflict at that kitchen table isn't actually about the legal paperwork at all. It's not about the indemnification clause. It's about the fact that asking for a legal prenup forces the psychological contract to be dragged out of the shadows. It takes all those quiet assumptions and demands that you translate them out loud into the cold, unforgiving language of ledgers and liabilities.
Exactly. The shock isn't the document. The shock is the sudden visibility of the psychological contract. We all walk around with these implicit agreements. I will take care of you. You will take care of me. We will be fair. But the moment a lawyer drafts a document defining exactly what fair means mathematically, couples realize their implicit definitions might be wildly misaligned.
I think for anyone listening, that is the realization that changes everything. So that is what this is called. I am not having a disproportionate, irrational reaction to a legal document. I am reacting to the exposure of the psychological contract. It gives so much grace to that stomach-dropping feeling. You aren't being overly sensitive about money. You are reeling from the sudden translation of your devotion into a language of risk management.
And this framework explains why the culture around prenups is shifting so violently right now. To understand the scale of this, we really have to transition into the science and the data. We need to look at just how common this kitchen table scenario has become and what the behavioral science tells us about the couples who survive it.
Let's bring in the numbers, because if you have been sitting with the shame of this conversation, the data is going to completely normalize your experience. According to extensive research from the Harris Poll, the prevalence of prenups has surged. In 2010, only about 3% of couples had a prenuptial agreement. It was incredibly rare. By 2022, that number had jumped to 15%.
Which is a huge leap.
A huge leap, but the generational breakdown is the truly staggering part. 40% of couples aged 18 to 34 have embraced prenups, compared to only 13% of 45 to 54-year-olds.
It entirely upends the outdated stereotype that prenups are exclusively for, aging billionaires, celebrities, or aristocratic dynasties. This is a massive, systemic generational shift. And behavioral science gives us a highly compelling lens through which to view the efficacy of this shift. There's a landmark study published in the journal PLS, one that meticulously studied the concept of joint planning in long-term relationships.
Joint planning meaning how couples systematically approach future goals together.
Yes, but specifically how the act of collaborative goal setting alters the psychological stability of the union. The researchers tracked relationship outcomes and found a 19% higher likelihood of divorce when partners avoid or fail to engage in joint planning. The mechanics of this are fascinating. Joint planning literally reduces the cognitive load on both individuals.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, by aligning the prefrontal cortex, the logical planning center of the brain, couples reduce the likelihood of reactive amygdala-driven responses during future conflicts. The conclusion was that the friction of collaborative goal setting, while uncomfortable in the moment, structurally maintains relationship stability.
There's also the study from the Marriage and Family Review that expands on how this communication actually functions, correct?
Correct. The Marriage and Family Review study isolated the variables of what they call collaborative communication. They found that relationships thrive not when there is an absence of conflict, but when communication is marked by specific efforts to share the burden of labor, to explicitly disclose individual needs, and to deliberately discuss the unique functional nature of the relationship. The data strongly suggests that the agonizing process of negotiating a prenup, if it is executed collaboratively, is actually the ultimate exercise in joint planning. It functions as a vaccine against future systemic failures.
Okay, I have to stop you here. I genuinely struggle to reconcile this. If the behavioral science so clearly states that joint planning and explicit communication are protective factors against divorce, why do we have an entire faction of highly respected clinical psychologists and family law experts who actively, vehemently campaign against prenuptial agreements?
It's a great question.
I mean, our source stack today includes deeply credentialed experts who argue these documents are radioactive to a marriage. How can both things be true?
That contradiction is the central tension of this entire field of study. To understand it, we must evaluate both opposing viewpoints with absolute impartiality. Let's begin with viewpoint A, the clinical and legal argument that prenups are actively detrimental to marital health. We drew heavily on the detailed work of Dr. Mark Goulston, a clinical psychiatrist, and Lori Israel, a seasoned attorney and mediator. Their argument is not based on naive romanticism. It is grounded in the harsh reality of contract law and psychiatric outcomes. Israel points out a fundamental legal flaw in prenups. They often lack what contract law calls consideration.
Consideration. I know that's a foundational legal term, but what does it mean in the context of two people getting married?
In traditional English common law, for any contract to be valid, there must be consideration, meaning a mutual exchange of value. I give you a product, you give me money. Both parties receive a benefit. But viewpoint A argues that prenuptial agreements are uniquely anomalous. They are often entirely one-sided. They are take-and-take documents. A standard prenup systematically strips one partner of the default rights and protections granted to them by state marital law without offering them any tangible equivalent benefit in return.
I see. So it inherently creates an imbalance of power before the marriage even begins.
Exactly. Lori Israel argues that this changes the entire philosophical premise of marriage. Historically and legally, marriage is designed as a joint venture. It is the complete merging of two lives into a single, unified entity. A prenup converts that joint venture into a self-protective merger. Israel highlights the devastating long-term consequences. Like, imagine a scenario 30 years down the line where one partner has contributed 100% of their emotional and physical labor to the domestic sphere, raising children, managing the household, sacrificing their earning potential, while the other partner has utilized that domestic support to build massive wealth that they have legally firewalled away in the prenup as separate property.
Wow. It effectively legally sanctions the exploitation of domestic labor.
Right.
The person who stayed home gave away their most valuable asset, their time and earning years, while the other person banked hard currency that they don't have to share.
That is the exact nightmare scenario viewpoint A warns about. And Dr. Goulston adds the psychiatric layer to this legal argument. He looks at what the mere request of a prenup signals to a partner's nervous system. He argues that demanding a prenup essentially translates to, I do not trust you to be a fair, reasonable, or decent human being if we ever decide to separate. It quantifies the limits of their affection. Goulston notes that the grueling process of negotiating this distrust creates a lifetime of bad memories. You are injecting litigation, lawyers, and suspicion into the exact period of time that is supposed to be the most vulnerable and emotionally secure phase of your life.
So you are basically permanently poisoning the well. You are stripped of your marital rights before you even walk down the aisle, and you carry that resentment into the marriage. It's a codified document of selfishness that encourages partners to hoard resources rather than invest in the shared ecosystem.
That is the profound danger. Viewpoint A states that when you enter a marriage already legally protecting your exit, you will subconsciously act in ways that accelerate that exit. You keep score.
That is an incredibly heavy, grounded argument against them. And honestly, it makes me wonder why anyone would ever sign one. But we have to pivot to viewpoint B, which represents the explosive growth we saw in the data. Viewpoint B argues that prenups are actually the greatest tool for transparency and equality a modern couple can wield. This perspective is synthesized from the psychological insights and legal frameworks of organizations like Hello Prenup, Madonna Law, and Lions Elite.
Viewpoint B counters the argument of poisoning the well by pointing out a simple truth. Ignoring financial disparity does not make it disappear, it just turns it into a landmine. This perspective argues that a prenup significantly reduces the fear of the unknown. We know unequivocally that financial disagreements and hidden financial resentments are leading predictors of divorce. Viewpoint B suggests that forcing couples to confront their financial realities in a structured, legally binding way establishes an absolute baseline of truth rather than a fragile baseline of assumption.
And we really have to look at the mechanical reality of the modern economy, particularly for that 40% of millennials who are demanding these contracts. Let's look at why state laws are failing them. State marriage laws were largely codified decades, if not centuries ago. They were designed for an agrarian society or, at best, a single-income industrial family where people married at 20 with zero assets.
That is the crux of Viewpoint B. The demographic reality has shifted. People are marrying much later in life. A 32-year-old today is not entering marriage as a blank slate.
Exactly. They are entering marriage with incredibly complex portfolios. One person might have $150,000 in law school debt. The other might have restricted stock units in a tech startup, intellectual property from a gig economy side hustle, or fractional ownership in real estate with their siblings. The default state laws regarding community property or equitable distribution are blunt instruments. They mechanically fail to process modern assets with any nuance. Viewpoint B argues that relying on default state law is actually the irresponsible choice, because those laws might unexpectedly burden one spouse with the other's massive student loans, or force the liquidation of a family business just to satisfy a divorce decree.
So a prenup, in this view, is not a document of selfishness. It is a bespoke legal framework designed to protect both individuals from the chaotic, unpredictable nature of outdated state legislation. It ensures clarity.
So synthesizing these two deeply opposing viewpoints, viewpoint A seeing it as the death of trust, and viewpoint B seeing it as the foundation of modern transparency, where does that leave the couple sitting at the kitchen table?
It leaves them staring down the ultimate stress test. If we look at the core of both arguments, a unifying truth emerges. A prenuptial agreement is a brutal, unforgiving audit of a relationship's emotional intelligence. Even Dr. Golston, in his argument against prenups, concedes this one point. The negotiation process offers a unique, albeit painful, opportunity. It shows you your partner at their worst. Or more accurately, it shows you your partner at their most defensive, their most protective, and their most vulnerable before the marriage even begins. It forcibly tests your capacity to navigate fear, power imbalances, and differing core values under extreme pressure.
It is the preview of how you will handle every future tragedy. If the science shows that this is a battleground of conflicting realities, my question is, how do actual everyday human beings survive the weeks and months leading up to the wedding while this document is hanging over their heads? Because the psychological weight must be crushing. What are the defensive mechanisms we use to cope?
Because the psychological contract is so heavy, and because this legal stress test is so intense, human beings reliably fall into specific, predictable patterns of behavior to avoid the discomfort. We retreat into our defensive postures.
Let's look at the patterns.
The first pattern we observe repeatedly is disguising defensiveness as logic. This pattern is highly common, almost ubiquitous, for the partner who initiated the prenup, who is most often the higher-earning partner, or the one with established assets. When faced with their partner's visible emotional pain or shock at the kitchen table, the initiating partner cannot handle the guilt. So they intellectualize the conflict. They retreat into pure logic. They will say things like, this is just how the modern world works. It's just a standard contract. It's basic math. We are just being rational adults.
Right. They strip all the emotion out of it to protect themselves. We're just being logical.
Yeah. Exactly. It is a classic Freudian defense mechanism. And while it may be factually true that a prenup is a standard legal contract, deploying pure cold logic as a shield in that moment entirely invalidates the other partner's emotional experience. It sends a devastating message. Your feelings of vulnerability, your fear of abandonment, and your hurt are irrational, and therefore I do not have to engage with them. It completely shuts down the psychological contract by refusing to acknowledge that the emotional dimension even exists. It leaves the other partner feeling completely abandoned in their anxiety.
Which makes total sense, and that perfectly sets up the counter pattern, which is pattern 2, weaponizing emotion. We see this primarily from the partner who is on the receiving end of the request, the one who feels hot, resistant, or blindsided. Unable to fight back with legal jargon or financial leverage, they use the only power they have left: emotional pressure. They might say things like, if you truly love me, you wouldn't even think to ask for this, or I would never ever do something like this to you.
It is vital that we approach this pattern with deep empathy. The feeling driving those statements is usually entirely genuine. The heartbreak is real. The panic is real. But mechanically, using that raw emotion as leverage is a behavioral pattern that shuts down the conversation just as aggressively as cold logic does.
Because it forces an impossible choice.
Precisely. It forces the initiating partner into a binary trap. They must choose between protecting their practical boundaries and proving their love. It implies that unconditional love requires the complete surrender of personal safety. It creates a hostage situation where no negotiation can occur, and over time, that dynamic severely erodes the foundational trust of the relationship.
When logic and emotion become hopelessly deadlocked like that, it pushes couples into pattern 3, which is perhaps the most destructive of all: the avoidance loop. Fearing these exact conflicts, fearing the cold invalidation of logic or the crushing guilt of weaponized emotion, couples simply stop talking about it. They delay the conversation. They say, we'll talk about the lawyers next week. Let's just get through the tasting. Let's just get the invitations out first.
Avoidance is the most natural human response to overwhelming threat. But in this context, it creates a catastrophic pressure cooker. The legal experts at Payne Hicks Beach frequently witness the fallout of this. They note that springing a prenup on someone or delaying the actual negotiation of the terms until right before the wedding maximizes the emotional distress to an almost abusive degree.
Because the wedding date becomes a ticking clock. What should have been a thoughtful, paced, 6-month discussion turns into a frantic, high-stakes negotiation where one or both people feel physically and emotionally trapped. The invitations are out, the families have booked flights. Walking away feels socially impossible. You eliminate the baseline psychological safety required to actually hear each other, and you replace it with pure coercion.
And this complexity compounds exponentially when we introduce pattern 4, the invisible third party. This is a scenario that is incredibly common, but rarely discussed openly. Often, the request for a prenuptial agreement doesn't even originate from the partner. It comes from an external force, their parents, the family crest attorneys, or aggressive business partners.
Oh, wow. That completely rewrites the psychological contract.
Completely. When a parent or an in-law initiates the requirement for a prenup, the partner on the receiving end often develops an acute, quiet, and deeply rooted resentment. It no longer feels like a boundary set by the person they love. It feels as though the wider family is acting as a board of directors, voting on the validity and risk profile of the relationship. It changes the fundamental dynamic of the marriage from us against the world to me against your family's protection mechanisms.
I can't imagine the psychological toll of that. Walking down the aisle, looking at your future in-laws in the front row, knowing with absolute certainty that they required their child to build a legal fortress against you, that casts a long, cold shadow over the marriage before it even begins. It makes you a permanent outsider in your own family.
Which brings us to the final behavioral pattern, what we define as the millennial pattern. We touched on the data showing 40% of young couples demanding these agreements, and we discussed the gig economy. But we need to look at the psychological why. Why is this generation uniquely obsessed with legal boundaries? Because it goes far deeper than student loans. This generation is comprised of the children of the divorce boom.
Right. They grew up watching the fallout.
Exactly. They watch their parents tear each other apart over the family home. They watch custody battles drain college funds. They struggled for years witnessing the chaotic, adversarial nature of the family court system.
So the pattern here is fundamentally misunderstood by older generations. It isn't greed. It isn't a cynical, detached lack of belief in true love. It is a deep, profound craving for clarity and damage control. It is a trauma response. They are trying to build a firewall against the specific type of chaos they survived in their childhoods. They are standing at the altar saying, I love you, but if this breaks, we are going to break it respectfully, cleanly, and without destroying each other's humanity the way our parents did. It is, ironically, an attempt to protect the dignity of the relationship from the cruelty of the legal system.
It is a radical reframing of the document's purpose.
And that leads us to the most important part of this deep dive. We have unpacked the fears. We have examined the clinical data, the legal contradictions, and the behavioral patterns. Now, if you are listening to this right now and you feel a tightness in your chest, if you recognize yourself in that kitchen table scene, if you saw your own defensiveness, your own avoidance, or your own deep hurt reflected in these patterns, we need to reframe this entirely. We need to dismantle the shame you might be carrying about this conversation.
We must start by reframing the resistance. If you are the person listening who felt deeply hurt, anxious, or profoundly resistant when your partner brought up the idea of a prenup, I need you to hear this clearly. That is not a flaw in your character.
It is not a flaw. Experiencing that pain does not mean you are bad with money. It does not mean you are irrational or overly sensitive. You are experiencing something incredibly beautiful and fundamentally human. You are mourning the idealized version of unconditional, boundless love. We are culturally conditioned from childhood to believe a narrative that true love conquers all logistical realities, that it requires a total, unhesitating leap of faith. When you are suddenly handed a spreadsheet that quantifies power dynamics and outlines exit strategies, it is a profound shock to your nervous system. It makes complete, logical, human sense to feel intensely vulnerable when your romantic union is suddenly evaluated through the cold lens of individual liability. Your reaction is valid.
And conversely, we must reframe the request. If you are the person listening who asked for the prenup, if you are the one who had to initiate this incredibly difficult, painful conversation and face the backlash, you are not cold, you are not a calculating cynic, and you are not secretly planning for the marriage to fail.
You are trying to establish safety. You are looking clearly at a world that is inherently unpredictable, and you are trying to ensure that if the absolute worst-case scenario occurs, you both have a map to navigate it with respect. You are choosing to negotiate the terms of your potential separation right now while you are deeply in love and deeply care for each other's well-being, rather than leaving those decisions up to a fatigued judge or a bitter adversarial court battle years down the line when you might hate each other. You are trying to protect the foundation of the house before you build it.
The core shift we want you to make today is monumental. This behavior, the fear, the clumsy negotiations, the late-night arguments, the tears at the kitchen table, the absolute messiness of this process is not a sign that your relationship is broken or doomed. It is a sign that you are human. It is a sign that you're taking the profound reality of a lifelong partnership seriously. It means you are engaging with the actual terrifying weight of what you were about to do.
And this is where emotional intelligence, or EQ, becomes your absolute greatest tool. But we need to define what EQ actually means in this context, because it is often misunderstood. Using EQ during a prenup negotiation doesn't mean you suppress your feelings to act like a perfectly rational robot. And it absolutely does not mean it is your job to instantly fix your partner's anxiety or concede your boundaries to make them comfortable.
What EQ looks like in actual practice is the capacity to sit in the discomfort. It is the ability to look across that kitchen table, see your partner's fear and say, I can see this feels incredibly stressful and painful for you, and simply holding space for that vulnerability. You do not immediately try to defend yourself with cold logic. You do not retreat into avoidance. You recognize that the legal document is secondary to the psychological safety you're trying to maintain with the person sitting across from you.
Sitting in the discomfort, not rushing to solve it, not arguing the math, just acknowledging that the human experience of this is incredibly hard. Because when we pull this entire idea upward, when we step back and really look at what is happening beneath the surface of the clauses and the asset schedules, we see that this conversation connects to the most foundational pillars of the human experience.
It touches on our deepest existential needs: identity, autonomy, and belonging. Let's examine autonomy within union. Philosophically and conceptually, marriage is the ultimate merging of two lives. Two become one. But psychologically, human beings are profoundly terrified of losing their individual selves. We fight against enmeshment.
It is the ultimate paradox of love. We desperately want to belong to someone, but we are terrified of disappearing into them.
Exactly. We crave union, but we demand self-determination. And a prenup, ironically enough, is an attempt to resolve that paradox. It is an attempt to draw a structural boundary that says, I love you, I am merging the trajectory of my life with yours, but I still exist as a sovereign individual. It is a legal reinforcement of the self. And if we look back at the behavioral science, there are compelling studies published in communication reports focusing on differentiation in relationships. They show that when personal autonomy is explicitly respected and supported within a union, both partners actually engage in more relationship-maintaining behaviors. By legally preserving the me, you actually strengthen the psychological capacity of the we.
And we cannot ignore how this entire process brings the heavy legacy of our childhoods into the room. When you sit down with your partner to negotiate a prenuptial agreement, you aren't just negotiating with the person across from you. You are negotiating with your own past. You are negotiating with their past. If you grew up in an environment with severe financial instability, if you remember the electricity being turned off, or the anxiety of a foreclosure, or if you watched your parents tear each other apart over a business or a house during a divorce, well, money is not just currency for you. It is not just math.
Money, in those contexts, represents existential survival. It is the literal mechanism of safety.
Yes, a legal contract for someone carrying that history isn't about hoarding wealth at all. It is a desperate attempt to heal or protect their inner child from ever experiencing that specific brand of chaos, powerlessness, and ruin again. It is a shield forged to prevent history from repeating itself in their new family.
Which brings us to the ultimate truth of this entire deep dive. Money is never just about money. It is the language we use to negotiate our safety, our perceived value, and our deepest, most primal fears of abandonment. When a couple sits down with lawyers to discuss a prenuptial agreement, they are not really discussing 401ks. They are translating their deepest psychological vulnerabilities into legal clauses.
How a couple handles the prenup conversation, whether they default to avoidance, whether they weaponize their emotions, whether they hide behind cold logic, or whether they manage to utilize true, empathetic communication, is the truest preview of how they will handle every other hardship in their life together. It is the crucible of the partnership.
A prenuptial agreement is not the beginning of a divorce. It is simply the first truly difficult conversation of a marriage.
It's the first time you have to decide who you're going to be and how you're going to treat each other when things get incredibly hard.
And that's why it requires so much grace.
Before we close, I want to leave you with one final thought, something to turn over in your mind long after this ends. We have talked entirely about how humans navigate these contracts today. But what happens in a decade? What happens when the laws themselves inevitably shift, or when artificial intelligence begins drafting perfectly equitable, dynamically adjusting smart contracts that track a marriage's financial and emotional labor in real time? If the technology evolves to perfectly mirror the psychological contract, will it finally remove the fear from this process? Or will outsourcing our trust to an algorithm strip the last remaining leap of faith, the romance from the union, entirely?
It is a question of whether we want perfectly engineered fairness or the beautiful risk of trust.
If this conversation felt true for you, if something in here landed, we would love for you to subscribe to Leone Patterns so you never miss what we explore next.
Leave a comment and tell us, what did this bring up for you? We read every single one.
We're building a community here, people who think about money differently, not as a number to chase, but as a human experience to understand.
You are not alone in this, and we are genuinely glad you are here at Leone Patterns.
Same pace, same questions. See you then.